Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Taylor.
And I'm your co-host, John Micton. Join us every 2 weeks for conversations with international school leaders, educators, and innovators who are working and engaging in the world of international school education.
And finally, just to say a huge thanks to our valued partner, Faria Education Group. We'll jump back in later in the podcast to give you some more information about Faria Education Group.
Hello and welcome to the International Schools Podcast. My name is John Micton. I'm one of the co-hosts with Dan Taylor, who's not with us, but will be with us next time. Again, we're getting some great share outs via social media. Seems people on LinkedIn, a lot of the things that we're saying resonates with them. So we appreciate your comments and feedback. It's always important for us to know how we're doing, but more importantly, if the guests that we have resonate in some of the learnings and stories that they're sharing. We feel so privileged to have these guests, and it's so nice to hear that many of you really appreciate listening to their stories. So today I have the pleasure of what I consider a friend, but not only a colleague, Dr. Patricia Angoy, who I had the pleasure of working with at the International School of Luxembourg. Patricia since then has moved on. She's working at the UWC at Waterford, Kamhlaba, as the principal, or in some cases we would call head of school. And she has been engaged with this. She has a long history of leadership in South America and many other schools, and has been really in the forefront of amplifying the narrative of Black women in leadership. And what's so interesting is that Patricia actually just finished her doctorate. So congratulations, Patricia.
Thank you.
That's huge. I know how many hours that must take. And of course, with your family and everything, that's a huge sacrifice. Patricia, first of all, it's such a pleasure and honor to have you here today. And congratulations on the doctorate. But more importantly, maybe you can just share with our listeners a bit about your story as an educator and where you come from and how you suddenly have ended up writing this thesis.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you for the invitation. It's to this podcast series. I'm really very, very honored and a little nervous, I must admit.
And now we'd like to say a few words from our valued partner and sponsor, Faria Education Group. Faria Education Group has been with you through thick and thin, helping international schools minimize headaches and easing transitions. Whether through paperless submissions with Open Apply, curriculum first learning with ManageBack, or school-to-home management with Schools Buddy, Faria has been your partner.
What's more, Faria has been expanding with additional services, including professional development for international school educators. Mini PD is a professional learning platform by practitioners for practitioners. With a global community of learners and coaches, Mini PD makes the learning experience more personal, flexible, and equitable. Looking for a PD solution for your school or something for yourself? Sign up for individualized coaching and enjoy a 10% discount using the code ISPodcast. Head over to app.minipd.com. That's app.minipd.com to book your personal learning coach today. Mini PD, embracing the learner in every educator.
You know, just today I was sitting at my work table here in Luxembourg. I'm on holiday at the moment, updating my CV. And looking backwards at this professional life that I've had for over 40 years now. And, you know, looking at those pages, I realized all of us who write our CVs, we're so much more, and our lives are so much bigger than those brief pages that, you know, we see in front of us. And we leave out all the important stuff, all the important things that make up your life, your struggles, the great moments of pride that you have in the work that you've done collaboratively, the people that you've met, people like you that I've worked on some tough things together, and some great fun things that have brought us great joy. Yeah.
Well, we had the pleasure, I don't know if it's the pleasure, but during COVID, we worked very closely together as part of the COVID task force team. And so we got to spend maybe more hours than we anticipated together. But yes, I do agree with you. Yeah. Yes. Sorry.
And you know, that was an example of how you know, we are the result, or the makeup. We are the makeup of all those collaborations that we've had. And often along the way, we've kind of forgotten just how important those are, because other things, those other moments that are best left forgotten, sometimes come back to haunt us.
Yeah.
And so I embarked on this doctoral degree at almost 60 years old, because I wanted to find out, what had I learned in all this time that I've worked in international education and in schools around the world? And if they served any purpose, what purpose did they serve for me, for my future, for the future of anybody else who may be Black, who may be a woman, who may be in education, and perhaps also in international leadership in education. And my life has been spent in classrooms and schools that have been diverse in many, many ways. Socio-economically diverse, linguistically diverse, definitely culturally diverse. And with schools and students of a wide variety of nationalities, even sometimes within the same country. Many of those with different ethnicities, different languages. I now work in Africa, so I work in a very monolingual country, one of the very few in the continent. But most countries are multilingual, and many countries in Africa have hundreds of languages, not just one or two.
Absolutely.
And then there are different religious beliefs, and all of these are sort of the richness, I think, of human beings, of the human nature of us. And it's important, I think, that rich tapestry that is present in our lives. But one of the things that has struck me over my 40 years is that I didn't see myself represented in many of the schools that I either attended or worked in. And so, for me, it was really important to highlight that in the work that I've just finished doing. And also to understand what values does it bring, what values are brought to the table when we can recognize ourselves in the people who surround us. And leading in international schools as someone of color and a woman hasn't always been easy, but it's definitely been really important to me, very important. Education sometimes isn't thought of as political, but it is political work. And it's the work, if you talk about my trajectory, I started in the Black women's group in Haringey in the 1970s, working in North London, where I lived as a newly qualified teacher. And then in the 70s in the UK was a time of racial turmoil. Sometimes, younger people think that this is the time of racial turmoil. Well, there has been this war almost for many, many decades and centuries, I would say.
Well, in the 70s, especially in the UK, with the National Front,
Exactly.
the Rock Against Racism movement, the Notting Hill Gate, there was a lot going on. And the miners' strike, that was a really tumultuous times.
It was, and many things were happening at the same time around the world. The Ayatollah Khomeini had come in, the Shah of Iran had fallen. We had Gorbachev come in as the leader of the USSR. We had Ronald Reagan come in, great friend of Margaret Thatcher at the time. And so there was a lot of politicizing of young people at that time. And at that time, in 1970s, I was one of those young people. And so there was nowhere you could be out on the fringes. You were either in, or you were for, or you were against, or you had to make a stand.
Do you think, Patricia, that idea of the political narrative and political engagement as an educator is something that's far more present in public schools? When I talk about public schools, state-funded schools, because of course our audience, public schools can be also mean a boarding school in the UK context, but
Definitely.
in North America, public school is a state-funded school. I mean, there's a lot of work in Brazil with Ferrero. I mean, they're just. Do you think it's more teachers that are ingrained in those more diverse and more intense socioeconomic school systems that are more political than, say, in international schools where maybe we tend to be more neutral?
I think sometimes what happens is that we have it's more difficult to live your political life within somebody else's country, and so I think, you know, I started in state schools, a public school as you would call them. For us, it was a state school, in a very difficult environment. My head teacher used to have to accompany me to the bus stop so that I wouldn't get beaten up on my way home. And I was dropped off at the school gates on my way to school in the morning by my, at that time, white boyfriend. So it was an interesting time, but I felt that I could and should and must take part in everything that was happening in the society in which I lived. As an international educator in a country that's not your own, it's not that easy. I don't think it's a cop-out for us, but I don't think it's as easy to be fully engaged in the political life of the country. For many, many reasons. Sometimes, you know, you can't because your contract tells you can't.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's because it's very dangerous for you to do so. Other times it is because you may not feel that you have the right to do so. And, you know, it depends where you are. I worked in Chile for a long time, which, you know, in the 80s during the dictatorship, and then post into the 90s in the return to democracy. And I definitely lived a double life there. I lived a life as a teacher at a school. People did not know where I lived. And I lived the life of the wife of a very prominent journalist at the time, who was very much on the streets, the barricades, you know, the protests, the hiding, the danger, the fear. And those two lives were lived completely separately.
And how did, so that was a conscious decision that you made. You were working in a non-public school, so in an international.
I was working in an international school. Yeah.
International school, and then your husband partner was very much involved in the political narrative. And as you said, in Chile, that was at the end of Pinochet's term, and there was a lot of upheaval. So was that a conscious decision to separate both out of more to protect you and your family, or to make those two separate things because they were really separate?
Yes, both. I think to protect my job, I needed a job. I was the breadwinner of the family. And I also wanted to be able to contribute to that return to democracy. I felt it was my duty to my partner and the people that I believed in. But I also wanted to be able to understand, and this is where the idea of diversity for me comes in. I wanted to be able to understand the people who, in a way, I was fighting against, but whose children I was teaching.
How interesting.
And if they could understand that I was, you know, flesh and blood, just like you and everybody else, but thought differently, believed in a different future, but also I could also influence those children, not in a very direct way or not intentionally, but just to say, I exist, other people exist. Just look around you, and you make your own decisions in the end.
So you were really, it sounds like what I'm hearing is you wanted them to have an awareness and at least be alive and awake enough to notice that there were those differences. You weren't going to tell them how to manage them, but you wanted them to be aware of them. And by that awareness, then construct their own understanding.
Definitely. And, you know, for many of them, at the time in Chile, in the 1980s, there were very few Black people in Santiago, and very few Black professionals in internet. Well, actually, I was the only one. And so for them, it was intriguing to have their teacher and then their, you know, head of year and then their head of school be a Black woman, who was not North American, by the way. So, you know, this whole idea that all Black people are either from Brazil or Afro-American in Latin America at the time, you know, it was the narrative. But I was somebody different. So, and I could understand Shakespeare. I could teach Shakespeare. I could teach Chilean poetry as well. So it was, you know, in a way, a curiosity, but not in a morbid sense. Just an idea of, okay, so there she is. She speaks our language, and she's actually got something to say, and she supports us. And so that was a very interesting time in my life, anyway. And at the same time, I also worked. I had just done my master's degree at the University of Warwick, and became their representative in Chile for students going to university in the UK. Okay. So I worked part-time at the University of Chile in the pedagogical department. So that was another time for me, and a beginning of a time of looking at, I don't know if you know Curtis Mayfield and A New World Order. Yes. Well, it was that sort of time in the 90s where there was this whole idea that we could create a new world. You know, there was something we were on the brink of something interesting. Maybe it was because this new century was coming. You know, we sort of saw the turn of the century coming towards us, and it was a wonderful time in my professional career in international education. I learned a lot. I was with a lot of people. I was involved in a lot of academic work, curriculum work, professional development for in-service teachers. So it was a rich time of learning for me.
And so, Patricia, you know, when we're going to come back to this role that you had of, you know, a teacher and then a head of department, and then a head of school, and then that has replicated itself in other schools. But why that suddenly, you know, most people at 60 don't decide to start a doctorate. So what was it that, you know, really drove you? You must have had something you're like, okay, I really need to engage with this. Was there a spark, or was there an event? Or was there some reflection that really kind of had you decide, okay, I'm going to make this huge academic commitment to doing this doctorate?
It was more, John, a sort of questioning of myself as I was coming to the end of my working life in education. I wanted to find out what I'd learned. You know, as teachers, we're also learners. And I thought, I can't stop, just finish, you know, end my career without having reflected on it. Okay, it took 6 years, a lot of money, and a lot of work, that sort of reflection. But it was really important for me to think back about what was the purpose? What is the purpose of what we do? That was the kind of questioning. And what brings somebody like me to work in an environment that I did not grow up in? I did not know about international schools when I was young, and yet had given me so much and taught me so much about who I am actually. And also, of course, the craft, the art, the science of being a teacher and being in education as in leadership.
And, you know, what's interesting is you highlight in your anecdote about in Chile, you were one of the few Black women, and very likely the only one in the context of your school. Is in that journey, your thesis is about Black women's in leadership. It's, you know, if somebody listen to this saying, wow, that's been a really lonely journey. You know, you've been kind of alone, but I never get that sense knowing you that it's been you know, you look at it as such through the learner's lenses. What was that like, you know, having a family, you have a daughter, you took care of the family and you worked, and then on top of that, being a Black woman as leader, maybe a minority or maybe the only person in the school context. How did you, keep that energy and that positivity as you moved forward?
You know, it wasn't easy, and it hasn't been easy, and there have been a lot of sacrifices that you make, but you don't think of them as such whilst it's happening. It's later on, as you look back, and I've had that chance through doing this doctorate. I have been blessed to have met some really important men and women in my life who've inspired me. And it has been quite a lonely journey, although I've been surrounded always by lots of people, young people, peers. And I think it's because of there have been some key elements, key moments in my life that have kind of changed things. One of them was someone called Claudio Lucero. He went with the first Chilean expedition to Everest that reached the summit. And he was with Jordan, supposed to have been the one who planted the flag, and all of that. And as they got to the last base, he went down with pneumonia, and he could not. He had worked. He was in his 40s. Was 45. He couldn't make that last ascent, because if he had done that, others might not have been able to go, and they would all the whole thing would have failed. And I went on a course that he ran, and he said to all of us then, he said, there are times when you work your whole life for something, and you get right to the moment where you're going to reach that and get there, and you have to hold back so that somebody in your team can do that. And for me, that was you talk about watershed moments in your lives. That was one of the professional watershed moments in my life. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to go forward with this. But I know that there may be a time that I have to hold back so that somebody else can move forward, so that we can all be in a better place in the future. And it's been a sort of mantra for me in my life, that I've tried to look around and see who in my environment are people, Black, white, male, female, gay, bi, whatever, trans, who are around me that I can actually push forward, that I can, encourage, cajole, make a space for, so that we all, myself included, can move forward. And that's been the sort of way in which I have managed through this. It has been quite a lonely stretch in my life to have gone forward, because there's always somebody around, behind, beside, that can be with you,
Yeah.
in some way.
And what I love about that is this idea of mentorship, where you know that giving that space, actually that amplification of giving the space maybe will be much larger than if you go ahead yourself. And
Yes.
The humbleness that you are sharing it's not about me, it's about the idea or the message or whatever it might be, the pedagogy. That's just, so powerful. Patricia, so you talk about, in your thesis, it's about Black women in leadership. Talk a bit about, are there a lot of Black women in school leadership? And international schools was really what you were focusing on. Correct me if I'm right.
Definitely. When I started, there were no other women that I could look to or turn to who looked like me or had a trajectory like mine. But I must say in the last, and it's actually so recent, it's been in the last 5 to 10 years that there has been a growth of women coming through who we have in some way touched each other's lives, and sometimes briefly, and sort of looked out for each other along the way. And one of the things that's really important, and I didn't realize how important it was, is all the sort of conferences and moments when people get together in international education. And, you look around you and you think, gosh, who else is like me? Yeah. In other contexts, you may look around you and say, who do I know here? And I often look for the people that I don't know. And sit at their table, or someone will come and sit at my table, in those breaks and lunches and all of those times that you have together. And those are the times that you can give each other a little bit of a pat on the back, or a little bit of encouragement, or sometimes it's, watch out. I'm not saying don't go down that path, but go there with your eyes open. And those moments have been very important to me. And I've seen more and more women in those spaces. And more women have set up websites. They've set up link groups that you can join and be part of. And that's very powerful. It's social media technology has empowered us. When I started, of course, there was the mimeograph machine and the typewriter. That was it.
Exactly. So far from social media. Maybe a little bad taste on your tongue from licking the stamp. It didn't have enough glue. Yeah.
Yeah.
You talk about in your journey that there were men and women that influenced you, and and I assume generally they did not come from the same racial background or experience that you had. But what is it about them that you think transcended that, and they were like, was it the way they were engaging with you, their understanding? Was it because it was about your skill set and your dispositions and your pedagogic leadership? How did that work? What were those people that really kind of, amplified you and you were like, wow?
Well, that most of them were people earlier on that I did not know and never met and have since died. They're people like outside of the realm of education. And I talk a lot about that in the thesis. People like Wangari Maathai in Kenya, people like Toni Morrison, was hugely important to me. People who, singers, writers, performers, people who they weren't the Ken Robinsons of the time. Yes, I read all of those pedagogical books, but they weren't the people that rocked my boat. They were other people who were doing other things that were brave and good and true, and doing the things that I wanted to be able to do, but in education.
So as you were being influenced, and like you said, maybe, you listened to a song or you read a poem that rocked your boat. And then, so was that something like, okay, that energy now has given me fuel to go ahead and do what I believe in is right in the school context?
Yes, definitely. And of course, the others of the students themselves.
Yes, of course.
When students validate you and show you or tell you or indicate to you that you've actually made a difference in their lives, they push you to do the same or something similar for others. And the more that you do that, the more feedback that you get, the more you're able to do the good work that is there to be done. And that's one of the really important things. You talked about mentorship. It's really important as a mentor. Your mentor could be a person younger than you are. I've had many mentors that have been younger than I. But there are these people who you seek out in life that actually make you feel that you can do something that you may have thought you couldn't do. And those are the people that, have been really influential in my life. I'll tell you a little anecdote. I used to work in one international school, and I moved to another. And as I moved, I had this group of middle schoolers, boys and girls who were into all kinds of things except English literature. And then I worked in this school, and I got they came to see me. They said, "Oh, we've come to see you, Miss Patty." They used to call me Miss Patty. So they said, "Well, we were now in the IB, and we want you to help us with the poetry section." And I said, "But I'm not in the IB." He said, "Yeah, but you were so good with us when we were younger. Surely you can help us." And these kids would come once a week all the way to my school. And we'd sit down there, and I'd be working and they'd be working, and they'd have their poetry out. And I thought, you know what? This is so empowering for us both the students and for me. It wasn't a one-way thing, and those are the kinds of moments that if I had had a bad day that day, during the day, it ended up on a high. How could it not?
And I can't agree with you. I think that's one of the things we are so fortunate as educators. We have those moments with our students, and it transcends everything. They say something, or they write a little note, or they catch you in the corridor, and it's so enriching, and it almost kind of negates anything else that was negative, and you can kind of move forward. And I so agree with you. Patricia,
and there was a lot of negativity. If I've had heads of school who've thrown things at me and, said things like, I remember one head of school, I was saying, I'm thinking of going back home. There's a position of a head of school in the International School of Guyana in Georgetown. And he says, "You can't do that." I said, "Why not? Why can't I apply?" He said, "Because, you're here and you're in this school. So you can't move anywhere else." And I said, actually, you know what, sir? Slavery was abolished in 1834. So you know what? I can do whatever I like.
Exactly. And, one thing which is interesting, and I think that anecdote highlights that, is very likely there are many conversations you had 20, 30 years ago that people very quickly brushed off. But I think today we're far much more aware, more mindful of the language and the body language, the Me Too movement and all that. And I'm just wondering, as you reflect back, very likely if you shared some of anecdotes, people would be like, "I can't believe they said that." But I think it was much more the norm. Very likely that head felt that was not inappropriate, that was appropriate in the time and the context. And very likely, I'm curious, have you noticed this change with time, or is it we still have those attitudes?
It's become more subtle. It's become a lot more subtle. And, not in the education context. I flew into where I am now on an aircraft that was on a Monday morning, mostly businessmen. And I'm sort of saying, excuse me. And, the person in front of me just could not give, they just were not interested. It's as though I were invisible.
Yeah.
And everybody else was kind of doing their own thing. And then in the end, I said, if you don't move, this thing is going to hit you on the head, because it was one of those low planes with the overhead compartment. And I was just trying to protect the young man. And he was just in his own, pushing aside and getting to where he wanted to go to without looking either side or behind of what was happening. And it's always interesting for me as a Black woman to sit in an aircraft, which I often have to do, full of men, and to just observe what's happening. No offense, John.
No, Patricia.
But I think it's the same if one man was in an aircraft full of Black women. there would be an interesting dynamic that
Yes.
you feel there. So
Yeah.
it's about, and that's really quite important to feel, because in our international schools, where we have students of all over the world, there will be one child or one young person there who's coming from a context completely different from the environment of the school, maybe new the first day, whatever. Putting yourself in the shoe of that young person, it's exactly the same as me in the aircraft, full of other people who, don't even see me, let alone, acknowledge that I'm there.
And you talked about that early on, this idea of developing an awareness, an empathy, a kind of a giving maybe our students the lenses that allows them to think, oh, okay, let me flip this classroom, or let me flip this situation and have a completely different context and look through that lens. And I think
Mm,
that's something that you highlighted. And I think that's something that we really have a responsibility, whatever your background is, because we want people to be mindful and open and empathetic, and have the capacity to discipline themselves to look through these different lenses. Because I think when you look through these lenses, you start seeing things differently. And by seeing things differently, you learn differently. And I think
mm,
that's something that is so important. One thing I can imagine, being a school leader, a parent, and a mother and a wife, balancing how balancing all that, because that is a lot going on. And then your own journey as a Black woman in leadership in international schools. Talk a bit about how you juggled all that, and
mm,
you kind of found your own space and your own mindfulness time so you could focus on you while taking care of your family.
mm. I'm not sure how well I have balanced all of that. In looking back, I did try my best. Um, and I guess my daughter always says, but mommy, you did it because you thought it was the best thing to do at the time. And you have to kind of forgive yourself, because there were definitely times when my job was much more important, or took on a greater importance in the hours that I spent on the job than the family. And I what I would say to, and I'm not here to advise anybody, but it is important to find yourself in all that you do, be you Black, white, male or female, or whatever you identify as, because in the end, you have to live with yourself.
Yeah.
And so you have to live with your mistakes. You have to live with the times that you chose to stay longer at school when perhaps you should have gone home. Um, the times when, the birthday parties, the graduation. I missed my daughter's own graduation. Can you believe that? I always say it because I feel so guilty about it. Because I had just started a new job, and I felt that I couldn't ask for time off. Even as a principal in the school, I felt that I shouldn't, that was more important. Not that it was more important, but that's where my duty lay.
Yeah.
So there are huge sacrifices that I think I have made that I hope others don't in the future, because it's actually not worth it. Some of the big things, I think you have to sort of weigh up what's important to you in your life. And some things, would I regret not having done this, or having done this 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And if you would, well, then make another choice,
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah, that's an interesting filter to use. And I think, as school leaders, so often we get, and you get sucked in to the business of the day, and it all becomes so important and consuming that sometimes it's hard to have that perspective, like, oh, I need to step out.
Yeah.
And I know we on the COVID task force team spent many late nights that we should have gone home, and
Yes.
we were all busy. Yeah, so I absolutely agree. You talk about finding yourself or understanding yourself. And I think that's really important. And I think there's more and more literature about that as leaders, is to give yourself the space and the time to focus on you. Talk a bit about how maybe you navigate that,
Yeah.
because you, of course, now are a head of school. You're in Africa. I know you know there's been some political unrest in your context. But how are you finding that time where you can focus on Patricia and make sure that that still is important more than the other things?
You know, I've tried to be much more mindful of my time. So, you know, I'm an early riser, so I get to school before everybody else does. And I have that moment to sort of prepare my day. And there's always a time in the evening when I think, okay, I'm going home. I love to cook. I put the music on as loud as I can. I dance in the kitchen to all the, you know, the music, soul music, rap music. I get all kinds of music from the young people that I work with. And I'll always ask them, you know, what's the latest? What should I be listening to now? And I do try and completely sort of shut myself away from my work and turn myself towards me. And I have done that consistently now for the last probably couple of years, since I left my last school, and I think it has meant that I can make better decisions. I am more measured. I take more time sometimes to do the things that I feel I need to do. I talk to more people before I make a decision. And one of the things I always say to my, you know, the people I work with is that all the things that go well, great, you all have done it. Anything that goes bad, I take the responsibility and try and learn from that.
Yes.
But
And
I
that's
do have these times that are just me. You know, I don't talk to anybody. I'm not on the phone. It's just me doing what I like.
Do you feel that you had to develop that discipline? Is that something that you consciously said, I really need to be disciplined? A bit like, you know, people go on exercise bikes or whatever it might be. Was that
Yeah.
kind of conscious discipline and you had to practice it?
Yeah, definitely. You know, I was reaching, I think, burnout in the last few years of um, before I kind of semi-retired, and I think it was that I had been pushing myself a lot. I'd been doing this doctorate. I'd been, you know, running a school. There was COVID. All kinds of things were changing. I was coming up to 65. You know, the bells were ringing. You know, you're thinking economically, how am I going to, you know, manage for the next years of my life? And so I sort of began to live a little bit more for me. And, you know, in hindsight, I wish I'd done that a little earlier, because I think I would have been a, a better professional. And I've been able to juggle things a little bit better than I have. Not that I was, you know, this crazy lady, you know, moving around. That wasn't it. It was more sort of internal peace that I found.
And I think that's so important, is this idea of the internal peace. And I think there's something, and that I'm also in the 60 bracket. I feel that as you age, that internal peace becomes so much more important, and you also are far more disciplined to work with it than when I was 30 and, you know, eager and you know, wanting to be involved in everything. So I think there's that kind of recalibration. One thing, you've been in many different schools and you've had many different leadership positions. When you come into the dynamic of recruiting and interviewing, how often has you're a Black leader come up, or has that never really been something and you've just been engaged as your experience, having been a principal or a head of school, another school, and leveraging that experience as a way to amplify your capacity for the new position?
Yeah. It's always come up. It's always come up. It's always been, you know, I've tried always to put myself forward as the professional that I am. But somewhere in my recruiting of me, people who've recruited me, or when I recruit, I've been to some of these big, what used to be these big recruiting fairs where you'd have thousands of people in a hotel.
Yeah.
The last one was in London, and in January 2020, can you imagine thousands of people in a hotel just before COVID broke, 6 weeks later around the rest of the world. And, those kinds of questions come to me. But it's also been interesting to see how people have been drawn to this person who sits at the other side of the table. And so you get some interesting conversations that have ensued. And perhaps it's allowed certain groups of teachers who I found extraordinarily interesting and different, perhaps, to enter into conversations and then sometimes recruit them if possible. And even if I haven't, I've had lots of interesting conversations. I love recruiting, by the way. Lots of interesting conversations with people, because people are so interesting.
Yeah.
Everybody's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we do this podcast, because there's so many amazing people. And I just feel, I love these conversations, and I agree with you. They're just so interesting. And Patricia, so if there are many people that are listening to us that, many educators look to leadership as another professional opportunity, maybe a growth, something that they really want to engage with. And there's been a lot of talk about women in leadership. There are a lot of organizations. Are there organizations supporting Black women, Asian women, kind of, more focused on diversity of women leadership? Are there organizations or groups of people coming together to support that narrative and really provide resources, or just a platform for people to share ideas and get some inspiration?
Yes, there are. And, COVID, during the COVID time, when we were all online, people started getting together, women who are First Nation women, women who are gay and in leadership, because they wanted safe spaces to talk in, not necessarily about their own personal situation, but just some spaces where they wouldn't be judged for who they are, or what they are, or the color they are, or their sexual orientation, and I found those spaces so different from when I would join another type of group where we would be talking about leadership as well. But I think we were a lot more honest sometimes, allowing ourselves to be a lot more vulnerable, because we felt that we were in safe spaces. And, it is a very vulnerable situation to be in educational leadership and in international educational leadership. You've got parents, you've got the board, you've got teachers, you've got your colleagues. They're all looking to you to do things, to be someone, to act in a certain way, to have the answers to this, to stop something from happening, to be a champion to their cause, etc., etc. So you have to be so much to so many different people, and you can't. So understanding who you are, what are the things that you're not going to be moved or shifted or transgress from, being very clear about that so that you're not swayed in difficult times, and to be true to yourself, to understand yourself and understand your limitations too, and to say, you know what, John, I really don't know how to do this. Can you help me? Or, Jackie, I think you might be able to do this a lot better than I. Would you like to take this on? I'll support you, I'll help you, but actually, I think you're the better person to do this. Or bringing in people, which is the great thing about that COVID task team that we worked on, a whole diverse group of people, but who had different skill sets. And working with those different skill sets allows you to be strong, to make good decisions, to make the right decision at the right time, and be sure that it was the best that you could do at that particular moment, because you actually had the skills of many more people than yourself to be able to make those really tough decisions. And I think a lot of leaders that I have seen in the past have tried to do it so much on their own. And it's that vulnerability and that humility that we all need to have in order to say, I need you to help me do the right thing. Can you come with me, kind of thing.
And I think in the past, and especially, and I'm sure I'm going to get it, leadership was very much a male thing. And the male thing was you did not want to show your vulnerability. And I think that in the past, that was often the narrative. I think with a far more multi-diverse group of people in leadership, there's much more appetite to be more open and vulnerable. And I think one thing that, and there's this theme that I think is coming up, Patricia, which I'm really resonating with me, is if I think of as new leaders coming up or new leaders engaging in professional opportunities to go into school leadership, this idea of having clarity of who you are, what you believe in, kind of the pedagogic moral compass, is really important to make sure you nurture that, you take good care of it, that you grow, that you expose it to many different ideas. Because I keep hearing that that's what you're going to tap into. That's what's going to guide you when you get pushed one way or another. And if you don't have that, you're just going to start swaying a bit with the wind. And that's something that really resonates as we're talking here today, is this idea for young leaders and leaders is just make sure you really spend the time knowing, what do you believe in? What are you about to not do? Or where do you say, sorry, won't go down that road anymore? And that really takes this kind of internal courage, and that discipline that you talked about is very likely you don't find that out without giving yourself that time where you're dancing and cooking and doing those things. And I think, to me, that is something that's really resonating. Is that something that you see maybe as one of the components if you engage in the idea of leadership in schools, women, be it Black or Asian or whatever? Do you think that's an important component?
It's definitely an important component. And John, we are bombarded by all kinds of literature about leadership that tell us, 7 steps, 10 something, 3 something else, and you've got it. Well, it's not true. It isn't as simple as that.
Yeah.
And when you just talked about this not being swayed, that's sometimes what young and older people are persuaded by the power of the literature out there, the entrepreneurs that are telling you all kinds of things that if you just do it this way, if you just follow this path, you will become this. But the becoming is quite a slow process, but it also is a process that has to involve other people from outside of your domain. So if you are in education, I feel anyway, that I'm a better person because I am nourished by other professions and other. And that's why I'm so passionate about international education, or education in which diversity is at the core, where dissonance is part of what you grapple with, where opinions that are very different from your own, religious opinions that are different from your own, are those that you can engage with and be with, walk beside. I can't remember the name of the author, but a Palestinian who was talking about how he walked beside his friend, a Jew, through the desert, side by side, and just talked. as you would with like two rivers coursing side by side that suddenly, at some point meet and become one, because the water is the same.
Yeah.
It's no different. The one on the left, the one on the right, it's the same water.
Yeah.
So, and when they come together, when that happens, that's magic. That's the magic. And it's the same, that's the magic you get in the classrooms. That's the magic when a student has been grappling with an idea, and then slowly you see it almost, that they come to that understanding. And so for me, it's about also not being swayed, as you talked about earlier on, by things that come your way that tell you that there's an easy route to this, to leadership or becoming. It's not an easy route. It's hard. It's hard work. It's hard. You're going to cry. You're going to fall. You're going to fail. You're going to, all of those things. You're going to be harassed. You're going to be downtrodden. You're going to be praised. And one of the things that we haven't talked about is that power, that power that you get when you can make a decision and others just have to follow it.
Yeah.
Be careful.
Yeah.
It's dangerous. It's really dangerous.
And unfortunately, we're seeing some of that in the global context that's not turning out so well. But what I really like that you're saying is this idea of the dissonance and allowing different, voices and perspectives coming into that. I don't think we understand as educators how important that is, especially with this whole political division fueled by social media and algorithms. And I think educators, that is in the forefront, is making kids comfortable hearing things that maybe they're not comfortable with, but giving them the tools how to have that perception and empathy. And as you say, be able to walk with that person so the two rivers come together. And I just think that's so important.
Yeah.
So important. Patricia, I'm mindful of time. What did you love about being a leader? We talked about the challenges. What were the things that, if you look back, those joyous moments when you were a principal or head of school, and you are currently one today, what are the things that just, you just give you that smile and say, yeah, this is why I do this?
It's after you've gone, after you've left. Nelson Mandela, and I'm no Nelson Mandela, but I've learned a lot from him. After he stepped down as president, after he came out of prison, and you look back and you look over your shoulder and you see some of the things that you were grappling with that have become taken on like, oh, this is the way we've always done things.
Yeah.
Then you realize, that is something that I was a big part of. I'm not saying that it was because of me, but I was a big part of that. And it continues. And people still feel that way even after you are no longer there. You talk about legacy, and you can't know what your legacy is until you've left.
Yeah.
You can't say, oh, I want my legacy to be this, because it won't work that way. But there are many schools, every time I go back to a school that I have worked in or come across people years afterwards, and who recognize me and say, Patricia, do you remember when? And I get this rush, this feeling of joy, sheer joy. I get it. I've had someone come up. I was in the theater at a concert, and somebody came up to me and said, are you Patricia Angoy? And I said, yes. And they said, do you remember when? And it was just, that conversation just went on for hours afterwards,
And those
are the things that bring me joy.
Yeah, they are so precious, and I think sometimes we have to be careful for finding that gratification in the moment. It's something that takes time, and maybe don't look for it, because it will come to you when you don't expect it. And that's what makes it so rich, I think.
Yeah. I was in a school, I won't say which one, but when I left the school, I didn't want a gift, yeah, but I got one, and it was a garden, and somebody showed me a picture of that garden last week with lots of little stones around it. It had been put back together, and I thought, gosh, it's still there. The gift is still there, and other people can enjoy that
Yeah.
space. So it's not necessarily a way of working, a particular curriculum that you've introduced, a model that you may have created with other people, but it may be a space, that you have left, and that's also joyous.
Yeah. As the little prince says, everything that's essential is invisible to the eye, and I think so often we have to understand as educators, there's so many things that we impact children that we might never realize it, but
No.
if we're blessed, like obviously you have, they come back and share an anecdote, or somebody 3 years or 20 years later sends you an email. I think that's what makes it so rich. Patricia, I can't thank you enough for this wonderful conversation and kind of going through so much of your rich experience and your learning. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for being on today and sharing this journey. And I know for a lot of listeners, always hearing that can be really inspirational. I wish you all the best with your holiday. And
Thank you. Thank you.
And I know you will head back to Eswatini here in a few weeks, and you're on the Southern Hemisphere schedule, so things are a little different. But we wish you well and your school community all the best for the rest of the academic year.
Thank you so much, and thanks to International Schools Podcast for inviting me. It's been an absolute honor, absolute pleasure. I mean, we all like to talk about each other, don't we? And,
Absolutely.
it's really lovely to be able to share with your listeners, with the listeners. And I wish you all out there good luck too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.